introduce a little bit about, well, actually, I'll take the chance, well, they're still fiddling with the technology, to welcome you as the principal of St. John's College to St. John's College UBC. We were founded just over 20 years ago by the alumni of St. John's University, Shanghai, but a very particular set of those alumni who had fled China to Hong Kong. And so St. John's University was founded by Episcopalians, so basically American Anglicans, in 1879 as one of the first of the foreign missionary universities in China. It became you could say, the Harvard of China. The first generations of Western trained doctors came out of St. John's, the first generations of translators, anything from English or into Chinese or the other way around. The person who invented or who helped create simplified text and pinyin came from St. John's. I.M. Pei went to the high school, St. John's High School, and then couldn't go to St. John's University because it got closed in 1952 because it stood for everything that the Communist Party hated. It was foreign, it was Christian, it was all the elite capitalists of Shanghai who sent their children there, generation after generation. So it's been closed, never to be reopened. That set of people who left, who ended up in Hong Kong, were those who actually brought the textile industry from Shanghai to Hong Kong. They're the ones who quietly created things like Shanghai Friendship Associations, where they, amongst all the people who were forced to speak Cantonese, spoke Shanghainese to each other, because that was the business language for the Johanians and those from Shanghai. And so they would meet at the Shanghai Friendship Association in Central, and they would do business, and they would very proudly speak Shanghainese. If you didn't speak Shanghainese, then you weren't part of their trusted business networks. So even a story such as Hong Kong and Cantonese being the dominant language of Hong Kong, well, one of the prominent counterexamples is precisely the Shanghainese who came down and to this day will still speak to each other in old Shanghainese because that's a sign of the world they left and the world that they continue to, inhabit, you could say. And so the Johanians of Hong Kong, when they realized that the Chinese government would never allow them to reopen St. John's University in Shanghai, one of the things they did was to create this college to keep the memory of the St. John's University alive. And we very proudly uphold some of the Johanian spirit here. We continue, in fact. Many of those Johanians actually came to Vancouver after they retired, and they still get together once a month, to have some enrichment and in their 80s and 90s. And so one of the things about St. John's that, in terms of the spirit of those alumni that we keep alive here is helping each other, and many of them help each other in need after being exiled to all kinds of places, the United States, Taiwan, all the way around the world. And so we are quite proud of being in that tradition, and the connections to actually Hong Kong are actually quite deep in terms of those who founded this place. We're actually sitting in Fairmont Social Lounge, which is in honor of Robert F. Ho, who was one of the larger donors to this place. And he's got, Fairmont Shipping is one of the largest shipping concerns in Hong Kong. In any case, just want to introduce the panelists. Actually, I'll introduce one at a time. How's that? It's probably the best way. So I think the first speaker we have is, and I hope I'm going to get this right, Dana Bourgerie. Okay, close enough. Thank you. Professor of Chinese in Department of Asian and Near Eastern Languages at Brigham Young University. And so he earned his PhD in East Asian languages from Ohio State University, and is an expert, well, I'll show you what you're an expert in, but one of the interests is obviously language, and especially Cantonese or the other languages in Southeast Asia and around the larger Cantonese worlds that we're talking about. So I'm going to ask him to make the first presentation, then I'll introduce the others after that. So I didn't give a break between the panel time. I don't know if anybody's discovered where the bathrooms are, but if you haven't yet and you really need to, they're next door, but there's also another set of staff rooms on the other side of the dining hall. Anyways, Professor Bourgerie.
Thank you. This is I've been to here about 3 times, and first of all, to our student panels, it made me think of, it spoke to me in 2 different ways. One was that it's about barbecue meats, which is something that I really love a lot. It's my main go-to comfort food whenever I get to Hong Kong. I plan it while I'm still on the plane. And so I know it'd give me 10 minutes to my favorite barbecue meat place, so I like. But on the goose duck thing, there's a lot of people don't know this. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and that explains my near Canadian accent, by the way. And we don't play the game duck, duck, goose. We play the game duck, duck, gray duck. And it's only in Minnesota that they play duck, duck, gray duck. So the transformation to the goose and the duck is there already in my world. And so, and I don't know why. It's one of those very strange things. It's a real narrow isogloss, and it just happens to be duck, duck, goose, gray duck. But that's not what I want to talk about today. But Cantonese is not dead. That's the first thing, and that's going to be clear in some of the things that I'm talking about. I was recently with we had a China education delegation at my campus, and I was having lunch, and we were making small talk, and I said, "Have you ever heard this expression?" And I said that they say sometimes about accents, and I said, "Di bu pa, tian bu pa, qiu pa, beifang ren shuo guangdong pa." So I turned this on his head. If you know this, it's supposed to go the other way around, right? It's supposed to be "jiu pa guangdong ren shuo putong pa," or something like. And they all puzzled over this, and they said, no, I think you have this wrong, because it's you, those Cantonese, who butcher Mandarin. And I said, well, how about all of the Mandarin speakers who butcher Cantonese? Isn't that worth thinking about too? And they were very earnest about it, and in modern parlance, I was trolling him a little bit. I wanted to tease him a little bit about the idea that Cantonese is somehow a second-rate variety of Chinese. But this identity thing comes out of some of the research I'm working on generally, and I have a kind of a complicated identity too. My name, Bourgerie, should work well if you're a Canadian, especially if you speak French, because my family comes from French Canada, from Quebec, and hence Bourgerie. It's a very Canadian family who goes back until about 500 years, and one of the founding families of French Canada. But I'm American, grew up in the United States, spent some time in various places. My dad sent me back to France for a while, trying to make me more real French-sounding people. And so I had to live up to this, my dad's expectations. He wanted me to marry only a French girl, but I disappointed him. But I still married somebody who knew some French, so that was okay. And so, you know, I had to fight against this thing as well. But this is part of a larger project, and I'm going to, for apologies to some people, be there on Sunday, but then I'm taking a little piece of a larger part of my research. And that has to do with this Cambodia Diaspora project. It's been going on formally for a couple years, but about 10 years ago I started going to Cambodia for other reasons, for some projects, and I noticed that I didn't know any Khmer at the time, and so people said, well, there's a lot of Chinese signs here, and I was lost in Phnom Penh once, and I just walked in and I saw a shrine, and so I tried Mandarin. It didn't work very well. I tried Cantonese, no problem. And they all started, and I said, this is really great, because I'm in Cambodia and I don't have to worry about Khmer. And then I go to all kinds of stores, and I realized what I found out later, about 80–90% of all business people are Sino-Cambodians. And not all speak Cantonese, or not all speak any variety of Chinese, but a lot of them speak something. And so this project started out with a larger survey, and because even this problem of identity right away, what am I going to call a Chinese or a Hua? There's terminology issues. It's not an easy question, and so I just want to share a little bit about some of these issues that I come up with in my research. And I'm working on a book length, and then I've also published a couple shorter pieces on education and the diaspora there. But the language education, the first thing I thought of, well, people who go to Chinese schools probably are the strongest identity markers at first. That was my hypothesis. Or if the family sends their kids to Chinese language schools, that probably means they're fairly close to their identity as a Hua or Zhen in the Khmer. Religion, there's both kinds of Buddhist temples in Cambodia. Theravada and Mahayana. Mahayana are the Buddhist, the Chinese Buddhist temples, and Theravada is the mostly where the Thai and Cambodian, Khmer and others go to, and that turned out to be more complicated. I'm going to come back to that. Language, obviously, do they speak Cambodian? Self-identity. Just what do they think of themselves? And that's not, most think of them sometimes as both. There's a kind of, this happened right away too. I would do my initial interviews in Khmer, in Cambodian, and I would ask them, are you Khmer Jan? Are you Jan? Or are you Khmer Jan? Khmer Jan would be the Sino-Cambodian. And they almost always would say, no, no, no. And they're very pointed about it. And I know they have temple, they have shrines, they have Chinese characters. I see newspapers on sometimes in the house, and they say, no, no, we're only Khmer, pure Khmer. And then we talk a little longer, and they say, well, I said, you have a shrine there. Well, yeah, that's my grandmother was Chinese. And yeah, my mother too. And we all speak Chinese. But they didn't want to say that at first. And there's partly a dynamic that's, you see one way or another all around Southeast Asia, depending on the political and cultural issues that go on. Obviously, Indonesia, with its history of persecution of Chinese and having to push back on it. Cambodia, in the Pol Pot era, ethnic Chinese were disproportionately targeted, not necessarily because of their ethnicity per se. Pol Pot himself was ethnically Chinese, but for relative wealth and education. So the profile, their class profile was dangerous. So the older generation would hide their Chinese identity, but now the younger generation now sees it as sort of a marker of middle-class status at least, or at least even a little higher status. They see themselves as better educated because they're going to better schools. When they go to Chinese schools, are better than the Khmer schools. Not as good as some of the international schools, but better. And they see it, they will say this very openly now. They will say, no, we're a little smarter, we're a little more sophisticated than the regular Khmer people. So they like to say it, but not until it's been established that they are Cambodian. Because there's always been this pressure in many Southeast Asia countries, including Cambodia, to say that, are you really Chinese, or are you really Cambodian? And of course, these days, the Chinese businesses are coming into Cambodia, and what happens there is that the Chinese companies want to work with the Sino-Cambodians. And then everybody says, see, all along, you were really Chinese, you weren't really Cambodian. So you can't win either way. This is a very common thing with immigrant communities, right? I mean, the sort of dual identities. People will ask me, because I have an obviously French name, they will ask me about my French background. I think my colleague Matt Christensen hardly ever gets asked if he's Danish. But if you have, even among sort of European backgrounds, there are certain ones that are more obvious, and so people are more likely to ask you. But obviously with Chinese anywhere, sometimes you're asked all the time about that. On the other hand, they wonder, oh, do you speak English, or you speak English very well? Some of you have this situation as if you could have 5 generations in the country. And Margie Chen's family's been in North America much longer than my family's been in the United States. But people don't really think of it that way, right? They think I must be the more current one, or the more long-term one, because I have a Western background. So this is a kind of an interesting thing. There's some underreporting. In the recent Vietnam census, the last one, it reported all of 1,000. In the Cambodian census doesn't report ethnicity, but Vietnam does. And it reported only 1,000 in Hanoi. Anybody ever been to Hanoi? The Chinese influence is very strong there, and you can see it everywhere. But it is not so popular to be Chinese ethnic in Hanoi, but there's a big enough community in Ho Chi Minh City where they report. There's a reported, in the last census, there was over 1 million in the Ho Chi Minh City area, but only 1,000. Now, part of that's because there were migrations, additional migrations, but I'm certain a lot of it has to do with how one reports, how one underreports, depending on the social context. Moving on a little bit, some of you read this, Lin Pan, who does a lot on this sort of thing, but this was in her foreword, and I thought it was poignant, and I thought a lot of the Chinese Americans, Chinese Canadians, or Chinese from any other place it resonates with, right? I'm one of 30 million people whose historical experience I try to invoke. I'm part Chinese the Chinese diaspora. I was born in Shanghai, immigrated by the terror campaigns of the Communist Party. I was educated in a manner of speaking in Hong Kong, British, North Borneo, England, where I established a base. I was going to say made my home, but that would suggest that I put down roots. Whereas I often get in the feeling that I am in England, that my real life is elsewhere, though exactly where it lies is difficult to say. And I think this resonates with a lot of people of Chinese background, where often they've been, Raymond, of course, I was just talking to his father. Okay, he's Cantonese from Hong Kong, but his father's Fujian, he's Hokkien from Malaysia. Or Indonesia, sorry. Indonesia, so that's not that common. It was mentioned the Shanghai connections. Many of the powerful elite in Hong Kong are in fact Shanghai background, right? That's, you can, if you learn a little bit, they might speak Cantonese, but many have Cantonese or Shanghai background. So it's really complicated. It's not so simple to say, well, they're pure Cantonese or whatever. Moving along, you know, this whole idea of diaspora and this evolving concept, and this is fought, if you look at the literature on this, it's fraught with political sides too. There are many people, and many in the Jewish scholarships that say, well, this is very much a term for the Jewish experience, right? The expulsion. Maybe we also say the Armenian expulsions, and sometimes the Greek. Historically, we sort of limited it to that, and the idea that it was forced relocation or migration should be a principal feature of this idea of diaspora. But in fact, even by those, I don't know if that's true, diaspora just means dispersion anyway, but even by the terms we're talking about here, the Chinese were dispersed. The people in Indonesia, there were tens of thousands killed and tortured in places like that. The Chinese experience hasn't been smooth in many countries. Sometimes discrimination, but sometimes outright hostility and terror. So whether we do or not, it's just difficult because it's a term that's being more used for this kind of thing now. So the famine war, the political upheaval, the poverty issue, lack of permanence, and these heritage communities versus refugee communities. It's the idea that how ensconced are you in that place? And that's not an easy discussion. That's a huge literature just in itself, just what we call diaspora. In a name, sometimes we talk, it doesn't matter, it's just semantics. We say this, but sometimes semantics is really huge, and it really matters because invoking the school of names in Mingjia, right? We want to talk about something accurately and to describe. And there's a lot of terms just in Chinese alone for ethnic Chinese. Huayi, which of course technically should be somebody who was born in country, but it's used loosely sometimes, right? Ethnic Chinese, Hua Chao, or Hua Qiu. Chinese citizens living abroad, usually born in China. Again, the distinction is not always perfect. And Huaren, which is the term that's most widely used that's the term generally used in Cambodia and most of Southeast Asia. You can't say the term Zhongguoren or Zhongguoyan, right? Because that implies a sort of connection to China citizenship. So these are several ones, and so just how you use this pure government usage. English terms, some less precise. What is Chinese? Are you Chinese? Are you ethnic Chinese? What does that mean exactly? A lot of the but you know, at a certain time, there was the Chinese government didn't even recognize overseas Chinese. They saw, of course, as traitors, right? It wasn't until really the late 19th, earliest 20th century where they were considered an asset. So you would say, well, even now, some of you might have experienced, some of you go back, if you were ethnically Chinese, you go back to China expecting a welcome. It's not always the case. Sometimes the local Chinese say, why did you leave? Why did your family leave? Did you not think we were good enough? So it's not always a perfect reunion, and so you get in this middle ground sometimes, and many of the students in Cambodia reported being in this kind of ambiguous ground, which is common and fairly typical for immigrants. This is just quickly on this. This is just another from Penn. This is a kind of a graphic, sort of trying to make some sense of different kind of places, right? The fully assimilated, whatever that means. Overseas Chinese, and you can see it's not real clear, but aspiring immigrants, students, Taiwan, Hong Kong. It's not a perfect graphic, but it's just attempts to sort of saying this is not as easy as saying these are ethnic Chinese, this is a diaspora, diaspora is X. It's very complicated. I would suspect in this room, there's so many experiences that it's hard to even nail down what that means to be a diaspora or to be heritage. And this is kind of a nice graphic. It just shows, if you just graphically the populations around the country, and this is not very visible, but obviously outside of mainland China, Southeast Asia, Canada, United States, and I think a lot of people don't realize how big the diaspora is in South America. I remember meeting some Peruvian Chinese years ago, and I was speaking Cantonese to them, and they were Cantonese, and they would talk to me, and they were really frustrated by how indirect I was. I was trying to be kind of what I thought was Chinese acting, being small talk. And then they said, "What? Get to the point. What do you want to say? Don't you ever get to it?" And they were acting very Latin, but they were speaking Cantonese, and it was very confusing to me. Here I'm the Caucasian trying to act Chinese, and they're the Peruvian Chinese trying to be more like a South American. I don't know. It can be very, very interesting. Some of the populations, and this is interesting itself. This happens from Mont Cartier, and this one is really, it's unreliable, but you see some of the numbers there. In Asia, outside of China, there's up to 25 million, but this is 2003. There's probably changed quite a bit, but this is the last one I could find. But just again, it gets down to how do you know? In Vietnam, there's part of the census. They ask it, but a lot of people don't tell for various reasons. In Cambodia, it's estimated 1 million according to Sino-Cambodian Association, which is about half of what it was before the Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge era. So a lot of the people who emigrated out of Cambodia, Chinese, were in fact ethnic Chinese because they're the ones that were taking the brunt of the persecution. Early history, and I just want to touch on this basically, but there's about a 500-year-old community of Chinese, ethnic Chinese in Cambodia. As early as the Song dynasty, they moved to Indochina generally, and there was secondary migrations. A lot of the Cantonese, despite the enmity between the Cantonese and the Vietnamese today, Cantonese, the Vietnamese and Cambodians today, there's a connection through the Cambodia diaspora, or the Cantonese diaspora, because the former Kampuchea Krum in the South Vietnamese was originally there, and that's where most of the Cambodian Cantonese were, and that's where the Vietnamese Cantonese were. That was all part of historical Cambodia pre-French changes. And so there's a lot of Cambodian Cantonese who have really close relationships across. They go to temples, they go to association meetings in Vietnam, even though the general populations are at odds very often. And there were Ming Qing refugees, and again, it's the story of strife and movement. In Formosa and Kongxia, migrant waves, mid-19th century, late 19th century recognition of overseas Chinese finally, and that's mainly by the mainland government. They finally accepted them as being part of it. Okay, this is just to tell you how it sort of looks from a Cambodian point of view. They use very different terms depending on their level of integration. It's really common. So, Qiujian, or Zhenqiu, raw Chinese, a new arrival. Koujian, cut, children of Chinese are cut. In other words, they're partly Chinese, or they're seen as that. There's Koutsuan, grandchildren. Kogachan, Kunjan, cut child Chinese. So these are all different terms. So people will often say they're this one or another. So it's interesting, they self-identify in subgroups even within the Chinese community here, depending on how connected they seem to be. And then there's the 5 subgroups, and this is all around Southeast Asia. You have these 5, but they're different proportions, right? So you have Chaozhou, Guangdong, Kejia or Hakka, Fujian, and Hainan. So Thailand is mainly Chaozhou. You get into Cambodia, it's still mostly Chaozhou, but then significantly Cantonese. You get to Vietnam, it's primarily Cantonese. But they're all the same groups, and depends where. Some of these groups, like the Cantonese, were known for their work in certain areas. They came and they were mechanics. So a lot of the old parts of Phnom Penh, they're all the mechanics. You'll know they're Cantonese. So you walk in those, you always can speak Cantonese because they're the mechanics, and they were the technical people, and they ran the shops, and now they sometimes do the computer stores and things like that. So there's a kind of, and there's a hierarchy too. Like some are more integrated. The Hainanese are the ones that are in government mostly, and they're the ones that consider themselves most prominently Cambodian first. Where the Chow and Cantonese feel their distance is a little more. And I know this is sort of subjective, and I have some data that I won't get to now, but if you're interested, we can look at that. Sociocultural organizations. So this is, the larger picture is the Sino-Cambodian. It's kind of hard to see, but it's Association of Khmer Chinese in Cambodia. So it's in Chinese, it's in Khmer, and in English in this case. And to the left is the constituent. They have constituent organizations for every one of those 5 sociocultural groups. And this is the Guangxiu Uyghur, right? And so this is, and so they have that. And so each one of these have their own school as well, that I'll come to. And so this is the outside, this is the plaque outside the association there. Notice their traditional characters, although along with the other parts of the influence recently of mainland government, the Hanban, they're starting to push really hard for traditional simplified characters, and they're sort of losing the battle because the Chinese government has lots of money to help schools, and they're saying, well, here's the curriculum, if you want it, here's the deal. And it's hard for them to turn it down. There's Chinese associations in almost every province of Cambodia, especially in Kampong Cham and Phnom Penh in the center. So in these areas here, the central. And there's pepper farmers in the south, and those are Hainanese. So they're often very different. There's Chinese newspapers. Those are the 5 main ones. They are in standard characters. There's some small ones that actually do in vernacular characters, by the way, but most of the circulation's not very big. Their radio, radio mostly now in Mandarin, but there's some Cantonese programming, some Chaozhou programming as well. Chinese education, this is a school, it looks very China-like. You could almost imagine you're in China. This is the Mingsheng School. And here's the main schools and associations. So here we go. So these are the Guangxiu. Notice they're all the Guangxiu because they all come from that same area of the Xiuhing. I don't know if you know, everyone studied, but that's sort of the supposed most accurate Cantonese. The original Cantonese is often attributed to Xiuhing. So a lot of times they all connect to that. And most of the associations all around Southeast Asia use that. And here's the school. This is the Cantonese school in Phnom Penh. And in Saigon they have one too, but they call it the Guanghua. But it's still a Cantonese school. And they're in most of the provinces. Up in this Ratanakiri, this is one place I always try to get to, and I never quite get to it. But supposedly as a Cantonese or Hakka school, and that way far apart. And the only reason I know that is because I looked it up once, a Ratanakiri Chinese, and there was some tourist from England in a tuk-tuk, and I heard them yelling at the school, "Ni hao, ni hao!" They're screaming at these poor Chinese villagers. And I heard in the background what I think was Cantonese or Hakka, but it was really muffled. But I know it wasn't Mandarin. And I think so there's a legendary school in Ratanakiri province that's supposed to, even the Sino-Cambodian Association doesn't know about. And I'm really hoping it's Cantonese. That would be cool. But I'll be okay if it's Hakka too, because I studied Little Hakka too. So this is, so what happened for education is up until the 70s, all education was in dialect. So the Cantonese Association had its own school, and they only taught in Cantonese. And then the Hakka and all of them respectively. But after the Pol Pot shut down all the schools, all the Chinese schools in Cambodia, they reopened in the 70s, and the world had changed. And the support was not there for the dialect ones, and so they opened them all in Mandarin. So the Cantonese school now, the Guangxiu school, teaches their classroom, they speak Mandarin, but in all their businesses in Cantonese. So if you walk in there, the teachers, the administrators are all speaking Cantonese, but they speak sometimes not very good Mandarin at all in the schools. So you get a sort of a funky version. I have some samples of this where I won't get to today. Back to identity and just wrapping up what I want to say here. This is one of the things that we asked them in part of the survey, what do you see yourself? These are people, students that are in Chinese schools and non-students who identified strongly as Chinese. And look at this, if you notice the non-students who are older tended to say both about half the time, but you see almost 80% almost of the students said I'm both. And so they strongly identified as sort of bicultural. And the last thing here, it was this religious identification. All the scholars told me you have to put in religion in your survey because it's a proxy for identity. If you say you're Mahayana Buddhist, then you consider yourself Chinese. If you say you're Theravada, you consider yourself Khmer. But look what happened, especially with the students. They consider themselves mostly Theravada now, even the ones that consider themselves very Chinese. So that's a shift, and that hasn't been observed as far as I can tell. But I think it's another way of looking at how well integrated you are. But at the same time, they're using the language many times. They're using Cantonese, but they're now Theravada Buddhists, Cambodian Buddhists. I'll just leave it there, except to say a couple things. Identity markers, again, family, religion, in what kind of Buddhism they practice. And that's it. And so thank you very much. And if there's other questions, I hope to answer them. But that's just a little bit of what I was looking at. This article that shows here is one I put out last year that has more of this stuff in it. And I have another book project that I'm working on now, one that's working on Cantonese variety and how it's been affected in context. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll have a chance at the end to call everybody up for Q&A. So if you have a question, keep it in mind or write it down so you don't forget. The next speaker I'm going to call up is Winnie Cheung. And for those of us at UBC, she's well known to us. She used to work at the head of the International House here at UBC, but since retirement has been involved in lots of different projects. The Pacific Canada Heritage Museum is how I know her, but before that, in exploration and the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop and many different community organizations. She's been, I believe she'll talk a little bit about, also involved in Hong Kong museums, projects on doing some work on overseas Chinese exhibits being put into Hong Kong History Museum, as well as an inveterate supporter of Cantonese opera and the kinds of theater troupes that come through periodically to Vancouver and organized a visit just I think last year or this year. I'm trying to last year. Okay, last year. Yeah. I don't know what time of year it is. So please welcome Winnie Cheung, who will speak a little bit again about another way of thinking about identity. A little different than the first speaker. So hopefully we're going to get a lot of different perspectives on the idea of culture and identity. Thank you.
While Raymond is going to set up this slideshow, I'm going to check my time. It's 3:38. I have 16 slides, so if I spend less than a minute on it, I should be able to get through without bogging down with storytelling. And that's my problem. I like telling stories. So it's getting a little bit difficult to stay awake. If you want to stand up, I don't mind that. And actually, that would help you as well.
I put them to sleep, now you have to wake them up.
I'd like to refer to some of the things you said. You mentioned about your name and how it reflects the multiple identity or possible multiple identities. And actually, if we look at most of our names today, especially people who have a last name that's Chinese plus an English name, the first name being the Christian name, then we get a lot of Winnie Cheungs and so on. And so I always add my initial in the middle, just to give people a little bit more to identify this region. When I was about 3 or 4, I was very sure who I was. no problem. I will answer the question with quite a lot of authority. I said, my father is Fujian, my mother is from Canton, real Cantonese, so I'm 50% Cantonese. So that's my answer. And I was the oldest child, and when my father courted my mother in Hong Kong, he did not know how to say anything in Cantonese, so I don't know how to manage to win my mother's hand. So when I was born, coming from his kind of background, Fujian, where it's very male-dominated, even though he's a very gentle person, he carries that cultural baggage. He would tell my mother very seriously, all my children will be speaking my language. Well, my mother demurely smiled and didn't say anything. Well, she knew that in Hong Kong there would be no chance for us not knowing how to speak our mother tongue, which is Cantonese. So at the end, we grew up steeped in Cantonese culture, speaking Cantonese the way they will be speaking in the capital. With basically not much of an accent or no accent at all, some people would say. So I decided that, for my topic, I'll talk about my emerging cultural identity as a Cantonese, and then how it kind of became dominant. And in recent years, it started to really, I feel that I'm waking up as a Cantonese again. Next one, please. So I thought I was half Cantonese and half Fujian. When we were in Hong Kong, as many of you would remember, whenever you fill a form about yourself, you're always asked about your native village, so we always put my father's village. So I would be represented as a Fujianese. This is a slide that I want to show you. When we teach or when we learn about culture, we say culture is like water with fish living in water. So we don't know about it until we are out of it. I only recognize that I'm Cantonese when I know that there's something called not Cantonese. So when my father speaks a different language, I know that is not Cantonese and I am speaking Cantonese. And the water or the culture that we live in, we breathe through it, we are aware of it only when we are out of it. It sustains us, it builds the sense of belonging and bonding because there's something in common for all the creatures living in this culture. Next. So what is shared by this, shared by the group? I would be the first one to say, of course I know that race is a social construct and so on, but when we talk about I'm Cantonese or I'm whatever, we often will be thinking about the inherited characteristics. So in my family, we know that we're from two different tribes. Some of us have darker complexion from my mother's side, she's Cantonese, southern stock. Others of us have fairer skin, and I'm not one of those, but I have my father's curly hair. And ethnicity, the geography, the historical background, well, we knew where father came from in a little village in Fujian. And I'm going to talk about the shock that I had later, about certainty about who we are. We'll come to that later. Culture. If we can move to the next slide. We have three very common iconic metaphors we use to talk about culture, one of which is an iceberg. So what we can observe is just 1/10 about water. The rest of the stuff we cannot see because it's underwater, and a lot of cultural practices we can see, the way we dress, the speech we use, but the value system, what we believe in, our orientation to time and space and what is important in life. All those are below water, right? And so if you go to the next one. Another iconic metaphor is the pyramid. So personality, human nature, most of the time we're born with it, but culture is what we have inherited and through practice. Okay? The third one is onion. So to find out who we are, we can peel the onion, layers after layers. And just like when we are peeling the onion, sometimes it brings tears to our eyes. And that's what happens sometimes when I was trying to find out who I am. So I was very sure that I come from two different cultures. What we speak, what we eat, you can see some of those very delicious food, largely Cantonese. But the middle one, the pastry from the Chinese cafe, so that's very much Hong Kong, it's not just Cantonese. You see the mixing already, right? So when we think about culture, actually culture is always moving and changing. And I have another metaphor to describe who I am. I am like a snowball. As I roll, I pick up things, and I grow that way. And it's not necessarily layer to layer, because there's chemical reaction as well. So I grew up in multicultural Hong Kong, where refugees and people who have come from all around the world, not just China, converged. And in a very early age, I was exposed to all these different Chinese languages and dialects in the same household, because my parents have taken on lodgers from all parts of China. So growing up, I have ears for different dialects, and I was not surprised. I'm giving away my age. Those of you who would remember Radio Fusion Hong Kong. 金色電台、銀色電台. Oh, so I am the oldest. We would have Radio Fusion Hong Kong radio on in the house, in the living room. All the people in the neighborhood would come and sit there in the evening to listen to the stories and the news and so on. So in Hong Kong, the beautiful thing is, within the same hour of news, we are used to having Mandarin-speaking news, Cantonese news, Hakka news. I don't think Hakka, but definitely Cheung news. So when I was very little, I already got tuned into those tones. So later when I worked in a Chinese university of Hong Kong, when the telephone operator was telling me how she was exposed to over 80 dialects or accented Mandarin, I can relate to that. That was a very common thing for me growing up, being exposed not just to the language, but also the cultural practices and the ways people behave as well. If we move down a little bit, yeah. Okay, so now I'm talking about, go up a little bit, up, sorry. I want to see the bottom.
The next slide.
Yeah, the next slide, please. A little bit more. So this is a dilemma a lot of us have. When we were put into Anglo school, because we talk about a sense of belonging as something that very important. You want to belong to the group, right? In the Anglo school, all the kids growing up, they, even if they were immersed in Cantonese culture and listened to young people fight, they would not admit it. They would be talking about the Beatles, right? I love Cantonese opera because mother listens to it every day. So we're all very familiar with Bin Fai and all these big stars. And yet, we wouldn't admit to the fact that we can sing Cantonese opera. So in this colonial setting that we have, Cantonese is my key, open sesame, to this cave of treasures. My key to cultural China. Very early on, I knew about all the troubles north of the border in Hong Kong. So it wasn't the political China that I was excited about. It's cultural China. And my mother uses this dictionary, a very good Cantonese dictionary. And that's what it looks like today. She still uses it. And I use that as a way of playing games with her, or she uses it to play games with us. And also with the tool, this language, I have access to Song Dynasty and also Tang Dynasty poetry. It is through Cantonese that we can get most of the rhymes from the Tang and the Song poetry. But in my school, I was secretly resisting being colonized. Well, I love the English language. I eventually took English as my major, and I have 2 degrees in English literature. However, secretly, I am trying to hang on to that lifeline. I don't want to give up my heritage. And in my lower 6th year, I had the chance, that's another story, I'm not going to go into it. It's really by chance. Somebody asked me to help her with her Chinese because she really wanted to go to Chinese U instead. So I helped her. And then at the end of the season, she said, well, why don't you sit the exam? I said, no, I wasn't thinking of going to Chinese U. Not that I don't want to, but that's what I'm prepared for, going to Hong Kong U. She said, no, I think you should try it. So I went home, talked to my father, and said, well, if you go to Hong Kong U, then you will be just studying all 9 papers in English. If you go to Chinese U, in those days, Chinese U was the only university that would allow me to do major in one subject and minor in another one. So I can have both. So I thought, well, no harm trying. I already know the subject because I have this girl in the class. So eventually, I was able to say, oh, I would only go to this college if they will allow me to do this combination. So they had me, and so I was very happy. And I have no regret because in Chinese U I was able to do more than just the academic pursuit and learn about my heritage more. But suddenly I realized that I actually have the chance to have 2 keys, one to the world, the other to my cultural China. However, we all know very well that language is something to do very much with power. I think Clement was the one who brought it in the first panel, how we assign different status to the language because of power, most of the time political power. So my father, even though we respect him and love him, there's just not the environment for us to learn about his culture. However, when villagers came to visit him, we could hear that language being spoken. And I would love to know more about his culture, but we don't have the key. And my father's cultural heritage basically is lost to us. I only know that it's for him. And at this point, I just want to break away from the slide for a little while. And show you something. So you all recognize what this might be? So I pass it around if you can. This is actually made in Japan, and it is a lacquer bowl. It's a miniature, I have to say. But when we were little, we actually had real big rice bowls that we use in home, made of lacquer. Beautiful black and red, sometimes with flower patterns painted on it. And my father wanted us to know something about Fujian culture. Fujian is famous for lacquer bowls and other kind of ornaments. So to me, that's a little cultural artifacts that can open a little window to a heritage that we have been denied in some way. And I always regretted not having more opportunities to learn about his culture. But then later I had a big shock. Yeah, that's my shock. So I was working in Chinese U, and one day the famous social anthropologist Barbara Ward wanted me to coach her so that she could speak to the Rotarians in better tones in Cantonese. So I thought, okay, she asked me out for dinner, I will bring some black and white photographs I took on my first visit to my father's little village. So among the black and white photos, this is the one that I also showed her, and I never thought anything about it. She looked at it and she said, so you're Hakka? I said, no, my father's Fujianese. no, you're Hakka, go home and ask him. So I went home and asked my father, he said, yes. I said, well, how come you never told us you're Hakka? He said, well, and that really hurts. He didn't mean to hurt us, he was merely stating a fact. And I thought, we are highly educated, but we couldn't tell the difference. He said, because it doesn't matter, if I told you we are Hakka, you wouldn't know the difference. Because in Hong Kong, the only Hakka people that we might hear about would be the women in the black straw hat with the little curtain, and they are the rural people. Some people believe they are the natives of Hong Kong, but really they also came from the north. So I was pretty shocked. I said, all along I thought it was quite clear who I was, and here it is not. My father was 21st generation of Hakka in Fujian, and yet he was able to speak Hakka, he actually speaks several languages, but we never had the chance to know about that culture. And as I got to know more about Hakka, I realized here's another long, long tradition and history. And that got me more interested in the migration. Why did people move? Why did the Hakka have to move all the way? And I always consider Hakka meaning guests. You're never considered one of us, you're always guests from outside. So the emerging Canadian, I was so busy learning how to be Canadian in a way. And before that, because of my education, I was doing my grad school among Kiwis. So every day I was immersed in English-speaking culture, learning about the Kiwis as well. And my Kiwi flatmate said, Winnie, you are occidentally oriented. Yeah, true, right. And I was dreaming even in English. So there was very little Chinese in me at that time. It was not like I tried to crowd it out. I was working so hard. I was doing my master's in English literature. She would be sitting there watching TV, knitting, while she was trying to enjoy her poetry course. I was thumbing through all my toolbox because, I know who King Arthur is. But then I would have no idea about all the meanings behind Camelot, whereas she grew up in that. Right? So I had to work more than double in order to catch up and to excel in that language that I've adopted. So the same when I became a citizen here, just like many of the new immigrants, we're so busy trying to understand the local culture, trying to do well in our career and so on. So for 30-some years, I always said I've been banished culturally from Cantonese, my first culture by default. And I had no room to really think about some of these cultural implications. So when I took early retirement, my sister took the chance and said, now you have to take lessons, learn to sing Cantonese opera, because we're going to put a family concert on for Monday. So that was when I started to use that key again and really reconnect to my mother culture. So retirement gives me the time to rediscover, reconnect, and also deeper my understanding of who I am and who I might have been. There can be many me for all of us. It really is a very interesting thing when people talk about cultural identity. Do we really have a pure cultural identity? I don't mean to use a value judgment word, pure. There are some people who believe in being purebred. But even when I was very certain I am Chinese, culturally at least, I'm not quite sure what I really mean, because Chinese is always a mix of many things, right? So when Peter Newman said, when someone said, I'm Japanese, that's a statement. When someone says, I'm Canadian, it's a work in progress. And actually, I like to say that when we say, I am, whatever you fill in that blank, it is a work in progress. It really is, if you are open. So I could have been one of them, but by accident, we all learn Cantonese, we all become almost 100% Cantonese growing up, even though we're exposed to other cultures we become multicultural in some ways. And then we come to the last slide. This is the project that Henry was referring to. Last year, I put on a Trans-Pacific Cantonese opera project in Hong Kong, Vancouver, and Toronto, where it's part of 150 Canada, multi-voices, one heart. And after taking lessons for a few years, my sifu said, you have to go on stage. So even though I was doing organizing, I really don't want to be on stage, so I tried to be one of them, rather than the lady in that hat. And again, that is just by accident. I never dreamed I would be singing along with these goofy Cantonese operas. So who are we? That is a very good question we can all ask ourselves. And I don't think we are just layers in an onion, even though sometimes when we peel, tears will come. Because there's always a sense of loss as something is lost, especially when we have lost a language. And this is why when my colleagues are putting together a program to offer Cantonese studies and Cantonese language, I'm all for it, because it's so important we maintain and continue the cultural heritage that we have. It is not just for one people, it's for the whole world. There's so much that's embedded in the language, which is a key to all the treasures that we can all enjoy. So this is my little reflection that I share with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Winnie. Thank you, Winnie. So, as you can see, there's lots to think about in terms of what identity means, highly personal way, but also I think, as Winnie alluded to, there's some broader themes, again, that pick up on, migration, on lots of different things going on, mixing with people, and as Dana's first paper brought up, people also trying to figure out what you mean by asking them who you are, too. Yeah.
You and I try to build a museum. You and I and a number of us, right? Yeah. We try to build this museum of migration, especially to capture the Pacific stories. And because we do museums, so sometimes we have artifacts. So I want to know, can you give me the word for this? What is it? It's made of wood. Cat, right? How many can write the word cat? Very good. So after 30-some years not using the language, I've forgotten the word cat. So you know what I do? I thought, okay, I would look at it on the internet, but I just couldn't find the right association. And then I thought of the Japanese wooden sandal. So I put a Japanese wooden sandal. I found the character of cat. The reason why I want to show you this is, I talk about Cantonese being my key to cultural China. And when we were little, the first thing I heard, again and again coming back, is a tick, tick, tack, tack. All the Cantonese people in those days, they wear wooden slippers like this. And of course, it's much better than this one. This one is just a modern and inferior version. It is lacquer. The one that I show you, the little bowl, that's made of lacquer and is painted. So we wear these things, and you hear that sound. And the Cantonese word, cat, the cat, 周圍去. A lot of Cantonese verbs are so vivid. And that's one of the reasons I was resisting being colonized, and I hang on to my language, my mother language.
Thanks. Here you go, the metaphor of those shoes. It's interesting, my wife is Japanese, and it's always, people are always saying, oh, the Japanese, they learned, how to be Chinese, and then they stayed, and then the Chinese forgot how to be Chinese. And it is this kind of, there's a joke in there, but there's also this kind of truth of how, Japan for centuries and centuries would adopt certain practices, certain kind of clothing, certain cultural practices, tea ceremonies, this, that, and they would absorb it, keep it, but always remember where it came from. It's one of the geniuses of Japanese society. But often things like manners and things that were a core part of some moment of Chinese civilization got forgotten. But anyways, segue, or waiting for the next speaker to get ready, is Chow, who, again, someone else who used to work at UBC and then has moved on to be doing a lot of organizing, community organizing, and creating programming and activities in Chinatown. She's helped found the Youth Collaborative for Chinatown, helped set up, sent a couple of students one semester to work with June and her sister Doris to kind of come up with an idea of a Cantonese school using the space of an original Chinese language school that taught standard Cantonese in the Wong Association building in Chinatown. And so that's been going strong, and one of the key people there is actually Zoe Lam, one of the organizers of this conference, has been the key teacher there in this Chinatown Cantonese school. And so speaking of the phrase hot and noisy, there's a kind of regular hot and noisy nights during the summer to have mahjong and other activities to try to help bring Chinatown alive again. So one of the aspects of Cantonese Worlds that I sort of mentioned that come up is that if you only think of, when you say the word Cantonese, if you only think of Hong Kong, then you lose out this sense that Hong Kong was the through place for a global distribution of Cantonese for 2 centuries. And before that, it was Macau and other ports up and down the Guangdong coast. And so this idea of Cantonese worlds being all around the places where Cantonese went. And even the name itself of for Chinatown, Tongyan Dai, that phrase Tongyan, which was now not used anymore as a self-descriptor, but that was a very Cantonese usage of people of the Tang Dynasty, and it named the places they lived, but also they were Tongyan, and they were China for them was Tongsan. So there's all these ways in which even the choice of the term, and going back again to the first paper of which term you use, even in self-reference, in response to someone asking you, who are you? It's incredibly localized, and for those who are part of that, those larger migration networks out of villages through places like Hong Kong or Macau or Amoy, that it really does matter. Ready or?
Henry can usually talk a lot.
I can. You can just you have to stop me. So
this mic isn't even on, is it? Is it on?
Can you hear it?
No. Is it on?
Okay, now it is. Okay.
I think we're trying to play a video that was produced by the UBC Cantonese language program for the singing contest recently. And that came down and did a little bit of a feature on us and our program in Chinatown. And that was supposed to lead into my slide.
Want to talk about first before?
I could try.
Why don't we introduce it? So June Chow.
So my presentation is called Local Born Chinese, or Tousang, meaning born of the earth, and Vancouver, Chinatown. And I'm pretty overwhelmed at speaking at this academic conference because I'm not an academic or an educator or a historian or a professional of any kind to be qualified to speak on either topic of Cantonese language and culture or Vancouver, Chinatown. But my credentials in both areas are actually extremely personal and experiential. Having grown up Chinese Canadian and identifying as a Tousang, and from active practice in place. And this will go to my next slide.
When it comes,
It's coming down.
No problem. I have a photo of a family photo, which many probably can identify with or see themselves and their own families in. I identify as a local-born Chinese, or Tousang, from a working-class immigrant family of parents and grandparents, and Cantonese-speaking household in East Vancouver. And my story is, pretty common. Grocery shopping in Chinatown with my parents on the weekends, attending functions of my Chinese association as a family, and visiting my grandmother who lived out the rest of her years in Chinatown after my father and grandfather died. Next slide, please. Today, this is actually going to be a wild slideshow when we get to it. And today, my sister and I, we are directors in our third term of the Hoi Ping Wigun, the Hoi Ping Benevolent Association based in Vancouver, Chinatown, which is pretty revolutionary given that we are female and technically should have been married into our husband's family associations. And we also are the co-founders of the Youth Collaborative for Chinatown, which is really just a name we slapped on our efforts in Vancouver, Chinatown that dates about 3 years back. This next slide shows...
You do very well.
Our two programs in Chinatown, anchor programs, are the Saturday School place-based Cantonese language, and then also the hot and noisy Chinatown Mahjong Social. And for the purpose of today's conference, I'll talk about obviously the Cantonese learning one, but I really like Venn diagrams. So this is a Venn diagram of where, you know, in my work in Chinatown, I've been really intrigued. I've been, you know, really thinking about these iconic experiences of growing up Chinese Canadian and growing up as a local-born Chinese, and where it intersects with the experience of Vancouver Chinatown as a living community that has a lot of personal resonance for many in Vancouver. But yes, we'll look at our Cantonese language program, and here's a photo of our students from just our last term. We've conducted 4 terms so far. So you can see from this photo a lot of Chinese faces. The majority identify as local-born Chinese, Cantonese with Cantonese and specifically some Seyup heritage. Some of them actually don't know it. It's really through guessing of their last names. So their heritage is either like full or mixed Cantonese. They grew up with some Chinese spoken in their household, and especially Seyup among their grandparents. And a number of them Sitpeng, Sitgong. They can understand when spoken, but they, you know, the muscles aren't working for them to speak. And they're largely split into 2 groups when it comes to kind of their experience with Chinese school growing up or as children. About half of them were forced by their parents to take Chinese school, and they hated it. It was really traumatic, and they didn't learn anything. So they're really coming back to our program as a do-over. And the other half were not forced by their parents to attend Chinese school as kids out of, you know, the kindness of their parents' hearts. They're like, we don't want to put you through that. And as a result, they come to our program with a void that they feel like they have as adults, not having this quintessential Chinese Canadian experience, this rite of passage of being local-born Chinese, and they come back and they're trying to fill that. Oh, this is tragic.
Yeah.
These are really good photos, actually.
Yeah, that's why your file is really big. So
Oh man, sorry. It's full of images because I didn't have any statistics. I didn't have any data. That's my CV, my very fancy CV. Grandparents, immigrants. Yep. You can scroll pretty fast. This activism phase that we're in right now. This Venn diagram that is as fancy as it'll get research-wise. These are the students, and like student profiling. Oh, we're completely almost caught up. That's really good. Yeah, and here are like kind of more the granular level. Stephanie in the foreground is like her family is, her mom is Mandarin or Shanghainese, and her father is Cantonese. So she is definitely Sikong, because they, tend to speak Mandarin, which is a little bit easier. Ronan in the hat back there is actually immigrated to Vancouver from Hong Kong at the age of 8. So he, again, Sikong, and also there's having come from Hong Kong, he actually has no concept of what Chinese school is, because Chinese school is like a diaspora phenomenon. It's in Hong Kong and China, there's no Chinese school. It's just called school. And then Maureen in the turtleneck in the pink is from an older generation of local born where Chinese was not spoken in the family at all because everybody's trying to assimilate. Next. So this is our classroom, and it is in the Wong Benevolent Association, Heritage Building in Vancouver, Chinatown. And it's the 3rd floor is the historic Mankang Chinese School that dates back to 1925, teaching Chinese, local-born Chinese. And this is Zoe, our instructor in the classroom. She is the only qualified one of us trying to teach, but Zoe also designed this program as a community program, a community level program. So it's conversational Cantonese with no reading or writing, because it's really intended for human interaction and relationships within the family and also in the community. And many of our students, actually, that's their motivation for learning, relearning their heritage language, is because they want to communicate with their parents and grandparents if they're still surviving. And you'll also notice that that our students are all adult learners, and they actually, meaning they actually have the agency, to come back and to reclaim this Cantonese identity through language learning. So that was the first 2 slides. The slides of our classroom, they're pretty standard in terms of like a classroom for learning, except that, it's historic and has the historic depth of it. But in the second half of our classes, we actually go out into Chinatown and its shops and spaces, and using it as a learning and practice site, because Chinatown is still an authentic, living Cantonese community with Cantonese and even Seyapwa spoken in the streets and the shops. It has, still very authentic foods, cultural products and practice, and this past month has been a lot of Dragon Boat festivities with making zhong, and then the daily rituals and relationships that happen in the streets. And of course, it's a physical record of the struggles of Chinese Canadians as settlers in Canada. So the next couple of slides are looking at our field studies and practice sites and how they actually serve as classrooms and how the people in Chinatown serve as additional instructors. Here is Zoe in the produce market, and she's not praying. She's actually demonstrating where hapzhenghua comes from, the terminology, because it's like palms together, like a chayote, and so that's her very devout. Okay, next slide is in a Chinese tea shop, and that is Daniel Liu, the second generation tea master. His dad is actually in the back there, and Daniel is. So this is like learning the thousands of year-old tea culture, but also from Daniel, who is not just a second-generation tea master. He also practices. So he practices kung fu cha and actual kung fu, and collects antique jade, and he also carves stamps. And he's also a father, father and husband. The next one is in the. This is at the Hansing Taiyokzhou, also a heritage building, and the actual Saturday morning practice of the Hansing Athletic Club, and that's Danny Kwon, the Bai Sihing, speaking with us. So yeah, the photos can only show so much because Chinatown is such an experiential place. And there's an incredible amount to be learned and experienced in Chinatown. And by extension about ourselves as local-born Chinese and Chinese Canadians and as Vancouverites and Canadians. And our Saturday school program is really just one attempt to try to tap into that learning. So the million-dollar question now is like, how can we learn from this knowledge, extract this knowledge, transmit this knowledge? But then also, my question is, how do we also put something back into the community? Because this is what's happening right now. Sorry, can you scroll down a little bit? Because I want to give the proper credit to, the other way, the Heritage Vancouver Society. Many of you have probably seen in the news that Vancouver Chinatown is, an endangered community. There's Heritage Vancouver, actually, this is the third year that Chinatown has been on its top 10 watch list, meaning these are endangered heritage sites in our city, and some attention needs to be paid on it. It's the third year in a row in where Chinatown is always in the top 1, 2, 3 type of thing, and it's been ongoing. So I encourage you to look the nuances and the ongoing nature of the issue is really laid out well by Heritage Vancouver, but it's really development pressure on this community is really putting its people and places and way of life at risk. So that's kind of the context within which we are conducting or holding Cantonese school. And the students always ask me, what can we do? And it's kind of, the next slide is really activism, Chinatown activism with a little a. And I always say, actively practicing in place of one's language and culture is really quite radical these days when it comes to Chinatown. If you have a Chinese body and you place it purposefully in Chinatown, that's a statement right now because of what is at risk in Chinatown. I really commend the students. I said, that they're adult learners coming back with agency to create new memories for themselves and new experience and relationships with this place, and to forge their own identity with Vancouver Chinatown as place. So yeah, a lot of people say, there's definitely coming down to the neighborhood and spending your money there. But I think it's a little bit more about the, again, occupying Chinatown, and also the language is actually disappearing. The slide where Zoe was explaining Hapzhonghua, it actually, that one actually makes me kind of sad, even though it's arguably the funnest field study we have is because and maybe I'll show how old I am, is when I was a kid grocery shopping with my parents in Chinatown, actually the produce mongers would actually advertise their wares, right? And they would belt out kind of their specials of the day, and that's actually gone. And so, if you have a Chinese body, place it there. If you have Cantonese, voice, practice it, and practice it publicly. Because, like Winnie said, language is power, and we want to rename these things in the community and have, exercise that muscle. And for those who want to practice activism with a capital A, I encourage you to go to SaveChinatownHeritage.org, which is where you can sign petitions, write city council, go to public hearings, which one is coming up next week. And then the next slide is just my credits, and with our Chinatown Mahjong Social, we're actually very purposefully occupying a key site in Chinatown that's been under a lot of attention, and under a lot of attention, and actively practicing the culture very publicly, and a lot of it is populating not just physical space, but also like the space in sound and experience to create that. So I do have to thank, again, Zoe and all our partners in the UBC Cantonese program for its support, and specifically with some really great TAs. Thank you.
Thanks, June. So we have one more speaker, Jack Leong, and just in this last way that June, in talking about Chinatown, is a very specific site in Cantonese Worlds. Jack's title as the sort of the director and the librarian at the Canada-Hong Kong Library in Richard C. Lee Canada-Hong Kong Library in University of Toronto. In there is actually two places, here in Hong Kong that are tied in his institution. So again, that mobility and migration as part of the Cantonese Worlds, the Hong Kong is this iconic site, and yet as going back to Leo's intro today to the panels, that somehow this place has become a place of hope, in terms of Cantonese studies and perhaps a way to think about Cantonese in all its sort of temporal and spatial varieties as well as linguistic varieties, in a safer place perhaps to think and to talk about it in ways than even that iconic place, Hong Kong, where we associate so much of the popular culture of Canto pop and Cantonese music, and Cantonese literature, Cantonese movies, Cantonese media. And so, again, that's why it's perhaps a fitting that we have sort of Jack round out this panel on identity in Cantonese, just because he's in Toronto, one of those other sites in Canada, and oversees a library trying to preserve, you could say, some of that history and culture of Cantonese in Hong Kong and Canada. So Jack?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And thank you for the organizer of this wonderful conference for inviting me to come here from Toronto to give a talk on Chinese Canadian identity through Cantonese opera and art exhibition. So these two activities actually happened in Canada, and they all started from Vancouver. So even though I'm from Toronto, but I had to give due credit to Vancouver because a lot of things started here and then gradually moved over to the east to Toronto. But we are very lucky to have a very iconic library called Richard Chow's Canada Hong Kong Library, where I am the founding director of. It opened 10 years ago, and we have been doing a lot of activities in these two areas. So I thought, oh, this is an interesting materials or activity to survey, to find out, to discuss about Chinese Canadian identity. So my presentation, as I said, will draw on these two categories of activities and to discuss the struggle and dynamics for Chinese Canadian. Oh, thanks. The slide goes automatically. Embracing the identity of being Chinese, Cantonese, or whatever other identity you want to associate or assimilate with, and Canadian at various mixed levels. So I argue that Chinese Canadian art and cultural production manifest the assimilation process of Chinese Canadian identity. So next slide, please. Before 1960s, most Chinese in Canada form a segregated community, usually centered on Chinatowns in major cities, such as Vancouver, Victoria, and Toronto. So with this physical, cultural, social, and political segregation, the identity of Chinese Canadians have remained unchallenged, which was primarily Chinese. Their needs of entertainment and cultural activities were fulfilled more or less the same as the people where they are coming from. That is Guangdong, or in other words, Cantonese opera. Next slide, please. So as the population of Chinese laborers continued to increase in the late 19th centuries and the early 20th century, a small merchant class among the Chinese in Canada emerged, providing the necessary network and business support for a whistling troupe to perform Cantonese opera that was perhaps the most popular cultural entertainment for Chinese coming from the Guangdong province. According to a website created by Canton, so evidence of earliest Cantonese opera activities in Canada came as early as the 19th century, mid-19th centuries. And by 1885, 5 theaters were constructed in Victoria's Chinatown. In the Daily Colonist, on August 4, 1885, there is a notice that reads, and here I quote, "The new Chinese theater situated at the back of Cormoran Street, which will be open tonight when special attraction will be offered." So on the picture, there's also the former site of that theater established in 1885. On November 4, 1882, the same newspaper reports about the arrival of Cantonese opera costumes. So here I quote, "Yesterday, the male streamer G.W. Elder landed no less than 16 trunks of similar make and dimension, about a cubic yard in capacity, filled with the costumes for the new Chinese theater on Cormoran Street. Besides this, there were a number of packages for the same establishment. The proprietor paid $900 duty on this stage property." So $900 was a lot of money at that time. Next slide, please. In the 1910s, most Cantonese opera performances in Vancouver and Victoria, and they would advertise in the only Chinese newspaper at the time, the Chinese Times, So according to a scholar, Cheung's studies on this advertisement, and he did it in 1995, so he found that there have been major Cantonese opera performances in these two cities from 1915 to 1925, and then again from 1930 to 1933, and then 1935. Afterwards, the visiting groups were hindered by the economic depression of the 1930s and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which won from 1923 to 1947, and the World War II from 1937 to 1945. Next slide, please. This situation created a void in recreational and cultural life for the Chinese community, leading to the forming of musical society, such as Zhenhua Sing and Cheung. This society consists primarily of music fans and opera devotees who gather to practice their musical and opera skills, such as Winnie. And so first for their own enjoyment, but then they began to conduct actually public performances. And this kind of tradition goes as early as April 1935. The performances were successful, and they were later supported by professional performers. Next slide. So after the Second World War ended, the exclusion and also the Exclusion Act repealed, Cantonese opera flourished and spread to Montreal, Toronto, and other major cities in Canada, with the influx of Chinese immigrants from Guangdong and Hong Kong that creates the market and talented performers. So you can see the picture on the left is actually the end of the parade in Toronto, and you can see they actually feature some Cantonese performers in the parade. And the picture on the right is a recent Cantonese performance in the library that I run. So in addition to the participation of local Chinese Canadians in the performance, Cantonese opera was transformed and adapted in the Canadian context in many ways. For example, female and male performers were mixed as early as 1915 in Canada. While that happened much later, in Hong Kong, it was 1933. The government officially allowed the male and female performers to perform together. And in Guangzhou, the government announced that in 1936. So when the audience will include more non-Chinese in Canada, the repertoires have been more movement-based with a more dramatic plot, so that non-Chinese speaking audience could follow the play easily. And also in Canada, we also have more make-up demonstration prior to the show and post-performance discussion, with audience were included to develop a more informed audience. Between Gold Rush period and the 1960s, Cantonese opera was the dominant cultural entertainment in Chinese Canadian communities. It is a popular hometown entertainment for most Chinese in Canada who came from Guangdong or Hong Kong with familiar themes and atmosphere. So it created a refuge and a home in nostalgia and fantasy. Next slide, please. So Cantonese opera have become an important cultural heritage for today's generation. Performances and seminars about this artistic performance happen from time to time in Canada. For example, in the library that I run, the British House, the Canada Hong Kong Library, in recent years, we had already organized the following performances. So in 2012, we organized the Billionaires Virtuosity and Creativity on Stage, from golden age of Cantonese opera to the contemporary theatrical arts in Hong Kong. And in 2016, we had the Cantonese Opera Development and Heritage. And then last year, we had 2 Cantonese Opera events. The first one is what Cantonese opera accompaniment is not in comparison with classical music. And the last one is working together with Winnie. We developed the demo and talk on multi-voice one-half Cantonese opera artistic demo and talk. So the next few slides actually show you some of the images of those events. So the demonstration and the next one, and then the artistic demonstration and talk and so on. And the next one. So that concludes my discussion on Cantonese opera. I'm moving on to discuss art exhibitions. So the earliest expansion of Canadian experience through art and exhibition probably started with a prison in Victoria from 1909. The prison building was called Federal Immigration Detention Center, opened in 1909 for detaining all Chinese immigrants who came to Victoria of Canada from 1909 to 1924. The building was being demolished in 1977, and some Chinese writings were discovered. David Lai, professor of geography, and also a prominent scholar for the study of Chinatown in North America. So he was called to assess the writings. He then discovered that these were actually Chinese poems and poses carved on the wall during those years. And they were later on covered by new layer of paintings and like through many decades. But during the demolishing process, they were peeled off and the writings were revealed. So when he noticed that, he persuaded the workers to let him take photos of the surviving poems and chisel 3 pieces of wall containing complete poems, which are now housed in the Royal British Columbia Museum. So in this prison-like environment, we discovered perhaps the first large-scale exhibit of artwork of Chinese Canadian laborers. The poems mainly express their frustration, discontent, and warnings to fellow immigrants, which indeed accurately capture the hardship and discrimination Chinese Canadians would face in the next few decades. Next slide, please. So beginning with the 1960s, the identity of Chinese Canadians started to get more complex. With the Japanese and Civil War concluded and followed by a few years of peace, China, from the 1950s to the 1970s, experienced severe economic hardship caused by social, cultural, and political unrest. Together with the possibility of family reunion and a more liberal environment in Canada, most Chinese Canadians had gradually realized that China was their home. So they are not Wakio anymore, they're actually Wayan in Canada. The subsequent new immigrants from Hong Kong and Taiwan were more amenable to the idea of adapting a new cultural or political identity as Canadian because of their exposure to Western education and their autonomy of choosing which country they want to reside. So, which were also enabled by their economic power and professional knowledge. So next slide, please. So along with the increasingly integrated and also the mobility of Chinese Canadian, so in various aspects, the evolution of Chinese Canadian identity and the implementation of multiculturalism in Canada, the last 3 decades have witnessed the maturing of contemporary Chinese Canadian art and culture, demonstrated by an increasing number of art exhibits and cultural activities by professional and community-based artists. One of the earliest national scale initiative of art exhibition is called Yellow Pearl Reconsidered. So I think many of the people living in Vancouver might remember that, which is a diverse lesson of experimental and documentary photo, film, and video work produced by Asian Canadians. Many of the Chinese Canadians representing the voice of new immigrants and of those who have been here for many generations. Curated by Paul Wong, the exhibition toured around and across Canada from September 8, 1990 to July 24, 1991. Overall, the exhibition project provides evidence for the emergence of Chinese Canadian identity through artist activism. It demonstrated the connectedness among artists and the audience for the visible minority, or in other words, the community of Chinese Canadian artists. The reception and influence of the Yellow Pearl exhibition appear to be profound. There were at least 8 newspapers at the time, mostly from Globe and Mail, which is a major national newspaper in Canada, about this project, and most of them praising the curators and the artists' effort to raise the discussion around the issues of race, sexuality, and diversity. The participants gained much recognition and success in their career. Paul Wong, for example, won the Bell Canada Award for video art in 1992. He continued to curate many important exhibits, and his achievement made him one of the Canada Council for Art 2005 winners of the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. Next slide, please. The success of the Yellow Pearl was followed by another exhibition project that contests the concept of Chinese Canadian identity and community. And the project is called Self Not Whole, Cultural Identity and Chinese Canadian Artists in Vancouver, which happened in 1991. The participants were mainly younger generation of visual artists interested in the collective historical project that highlight family and communal histories, as collectively, as well as their awareness of the internal differences within their ethnic communities. This group project was organized by visual artist Henry Cheung and filmmaker Kevin Lee, and it happened in the Chinese Cultural Center in Vancouver, Chinatown, and they questioned the notion of a homogeneous identity, collective memories, and common origin of a community. So they emphasized community as a site of political and cultural negotiation. So I think throughout the day we have discussed a lot of Cantonese, even within Cantonese there's Taiwanese, Taiwanese, and so on and so forth. Right? So this is following along the line of this kind of discussion. So for this project there was less news report. I can only find one major news report in Globe and Mail in February 9, 1993 by Chris Duffel. So it was published in the context of discussing the artist's changing approaches of confrontation to transformation. So this project received less media attention compared to the Yellow Pearl. Nevertheless, it specifically brings up the discussion and questions the concept of homogeneous Chinese Canadian identity and community. So next slide, please. So in 2017, finally, it came to Toronto. So my library sponsored an exhibition project entitled Far and Near, The Distances Between Us. It was curated by Henry Hen Lu. The project exhibits Chinese Canadian artists' artwork since 1990s. It attempts to connect the Yellow Pearl and Self Not Whole project with the more recent generation of artists. In the words of the curator, here I quote, so the exhibition offers recent perspectives onto the Chinese Canadian community's historical and cultural evolution, exploring notions of distancing and being distant in relation to race, identity, sexuality, and their intersection with Chinese Canadian history. So this project includes the works of Hu Song's I Am Who I Am, Current Thames Gold Mountain Restaurant Project, Will Grant's If All You Have Is a Hammer, Everything Sounds Like a Nail, Elvis Choi's Alien in Residence at Value Village, and Junhua Kathleen Dong's Skin Deep. So next slide. So this is my last slide. So this review of art and cultural activities for and by Chinese Canadians depicts a gradual, I hope you can see that it's a gradual improvement for Chinese Canadians in terms of identity, accumulation, and assimilation. With the repeal of the Chinese Immigration Act in 1947, the adoption of the point system in immigration policy in 1967, and the introduction of multiculturalism policy in 1971, Canada indeed have become a country that becoming a more welcoming country for Chinese Canadian artists to question and challenge racism and stereotypical and homogeneous understanding of Chinese Canadian identity. With the continued momentum in the fusion of Canadian and Chinese art and cultural presentation, Chinese Canadian art practices may perhaps be better represented in major spheres of Canadian contemporary art, and also Chinese Canadian artwork and artists become part of the Canadian art history. Thank you.
Actually, unfortunately, Henry, he had to run off for another commitment. And I know we are actually approaching the end of the program for today for the time, but I think we should still take a couple questions if you would like to ask the 4 previous presenters. We'll just spend a few minutes if you don't mind. So any questions, comments for the 4 presenters?
I think many of us may recognize ourselves or treasure our identity as a Chinese, but for those who live or born in Canada, or even for those who live in Hong Kong and deny themselves as a Chinese, how should we help them to recognize themselves and help them to treasure the value of Chinese culture?
Are you asking any specific presenter or any of them can respond to that? Are you asking Jack? Oh, Winnie? Yeah, okay.
I like to make a reference to my own experience growing up in Hong Kong. I said I recognized I was Chinese, steeped in Cantonese culture, but I didn't stop it there. However, I am trying to link and tap into this rich heritage called cultural China, not the political China. So I don't know whether this may be one of the ways some people actually can make that connection, because we're not just bound by the cultural geography. We're not bound by geography. So my way of doing it is to be linked and tap into that rich heritage that I call cultural China. And the same with the people that I deal with here in Canada, including my own daughter. How would she be able to tap into the heritage of her parents and grandparents? So if you look at that they have a lot of windows and opportunities, but sometimes they're so busy living their life, they don't really make use of those opportunities. I don't know whether that addresses your question.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to say, a lot of people, in answer to your question, a lot of people when they're younger, they don't think about their Chinese identity that much. But as they grow older, oftentimes they encounter experiences which makes them want to reach out and explore that when they're older. And so that person that looks like they don't care when they're younger, they might actually be looking for more answers when they get older. And so I think that there's lacking a lot of things for older people who are not visiting who want to learn about their Chinese culture. So for example, as a person who wanted to learn Cantonese, I wasn't allowed to go to the kids' school because I'm too old. And then it was hard for me to find a teacher. And anyway, so that more resources were added.
Anyone want to respond to that? Or? Okay, let's one more final question if there is. Okay, go ahead, please.
I'm curious that as most of you have mentioned that you know some Chinese culture and such as opera, you mentioned before, and then do you think that we have the duty to know the news in China, and then maybe we should have to work out our ethnic spirits and do something to help those who live in China rather than just know the culture only?
Would you like to direct the question to, or just open to all for anyone?
If no one is answering, I'd like to respond to that particular. I don't want to give the impression that I was cutting myself off from political China. We live so close to China, north of the border. We were linked in so many ways. So the emotion is there, and we actually grew up experiencing all the different movements in China as well. And a lot of us growing up in Hong Kong, my generation was basically almost the first generation that claimed ourselves to be Hong Kong belongers. But many of us were so emotionally tied to China. We actually did a lot of things to support the people in China as well as whatever China was trying to do to improve lives in China. So in the 80s, for example, we would go back at the invitation of Guangdong province, and they selected 40 teachers in the school system of the whole province, invite some of the teachers in Hong Kong. So we would go give up quite a few weeks of our summer holiday to go help them teach the teachers. And we would be bringing our own typewriter and everything that we would give away. So it's not very simple, that relationship, the love and hate and all the complex emotions of China. And basically that tie to our heritage is much more than just food and practices, music, and so on. It's much more, it's so deep, I don't know how to explain it. So yes, many of us feel we are tied, we're all connected.
Yeah, I just want to add that for example, the project that you students have done together with MU and going back to Kaiping to mingle and talk with the villagers in Guangdong. Actually, that is one way to actually make some changes or make some helping people there, because they will then expose to, oh, okay, these are actually students from Vancouver and they are very interested in our tradition and our culture. So that also, I think, will make a positive impact on their life and their villages. And also for university and in Vancouver and Toronto, we have a lot of exchange, like students, and scholars, and so on. So I think that in this kind of cultural and exhibition activity, there's always a mixed effort between local Chinese Canadian and also people from Hong Kong or from other regions of China. And we work on some of the projects together, especially in recent decades.
Okay. Yeah, I guess as we conclude, I would just end by saying that we should just keep the conversations going and keep the communication channels open. We keep discussing all these important issues. And at this point, this concludes our third forum. And once again, we express our gratitude and thanks to all four presenters for this forum, for their wonderful presentations. And this also concludes our first day of Cantonese Worlds. But this is not the end. We are only halfway through. So we would like to invite you to join us tomorrow, starting at 9 o'clock, right? At 9:30, I'm sorry, 9:30 at Richmond Public Library. And we have two workshops. The first workshop is a conversation between Hong Kong lyricist Chris Cheung from Weizhong Xinzang and our music professor Hedy Leong from UBC. So they will talk about the development of musicals in Cantonese, Cantonese musicals. And then in the afternoon at 1 o'clock, we will have a Cantonese lyric master class. So Mr. Chris Cheung will once again, actually you'll get some hands-on experience. Learning from his experience, and then you'll get hands-on experience to learn some techniques, how to do Cantonese lyrics. And also we'll have a couple singing demonstrations, so hopefully it will be a very interesting and yeah, hopefully you'll get something out of it. So we would like to invite you to join us. So hopefully see you tomorrow and have a good evening. Thank you very much.